He died at 88, but not before leaving one final message, and it was for King Charles. A sealed letter, hand-delivered by the Vatican just hours before Pope Francis passed away. No explanation, no public statement, just silence from the palace, and a whisper from insiders. The contents were deeply personal and urgent. Popes don't send private messages to kings, especially not non-Catholics. But this wasn't just a farewell. It was a message that rattled the foundations of the church and the crown. Was it a blessing, a warning, or something far more dangerous? Because what few realized was how deeply their lives had quietly intertwined behind palace doors. They were never supposed to be friends. One, the leader of the Catholic Church, bound by centuries of doctrine and tradition. The other, a British monarch in waiting, shaped by royal formality and restrained by public duty. And yet, long before the world heard about a letter, Pope Francis and King Charles had been quietly building a bond that defied every expectation. It didn't begin with a handshake at a formal event or a photo op for the press. In fact, most of the world never even noticed. But behind closed doors, starting as far back as 2017, something strange was unfolding. A series of hushed meetings at the Vatican that would never make the headlines. These weren't political briefings or ceremonial visits. They were intimate conversations about the planet, about faith, about how to lead when you're no longer sure anyone is listening. During one such meeting, Charles reportedly arrived without a large entourage, opting instead for a modest car and only a few aides. Vatican staff found it unusual, but it matched the tone of the encounter. Inside those ancient walls, the two men didn't speak like heads of institutions. They spoke like men nearing the end of something, men reflecting on what they'd built, what they'd broken, and what still haunted them. Climate change, the crisis of poverty, the fragility of peace. They spoke about these issues not as headlines, but as burdens. Charles shared how he had been dismissed for decades as a fanatic for caring too much about the environment. Pope Francis nodded, knowing well the cost of speaking truths others didn't want to hear. And then came the unexpected thread that wove them tighter together. Guilt. Not the abstract kind that clings to politicians or figureheads. This was personal, bone deep, and quietly corrosive. Francis, once a young Jesuit navigating the political unrest of Argentina, knew what it meant to carry regret in silence. And Charles? His shame was etched into the public record, his failed marriage, the years of scandal, the endless whispers about Diana. One Vatican aide, speaking under condition of anonymity, recalled hearing the Pope say, "He carries more guilt than most kings." That line stuck, because it wasn't judgment, it was empathy. Two men, two crowns, united not by power, but by the weight of public expectation and private failure. What they found in each other wasn't alliance, it was understanding. A shared awareness that the world they represented was changing faster than it could handle. They both knew the limits of their influence. They knew that faith and monarchy were no longer sacred shields in the eyes of the public. And still, they tried. Together, they quietly strategized ways to make their roles matter again, less through authority, more through humility. Pope Francis began citing environmental concerns more boldly in his encyclicals. Charles grew more outspoken in interfaith events, sometimes borrowing language that sounded suspiciously similar to the Pope's public statements. But this spiritual bond wasn't just mutual admiration, it was born from pain. It was the invisible tether between two aging figures, both watching their legacies form while the world looked elsewhere. And when they spoke, it wasn't about status or pageantry. It was about legacy, about what would be left behind once they were gone. But this relationship wasn't built on admiration alone. It was shaped by pain and by the ghosts they both carried. From the moment he took his first breath, Charles wasn't treated like a child, he was treated like an heir. The crown came first. His emotions came last. Raised inside the cold symmetry of palace walls, his days were structured by protocol, not affection. Nannies were his primary caregivers. Palace aides, not parents, orchestrated his schedule. While the cameras captured rare smiles beside his mother, Queen Elizabeth, the reality behind the scenes was far colder. Charles would later admit what most already suspected. She wasn't the kind of mom to tuck you in at night. That one sentence carried the weight of a lifetime. It wasn't bitterness, it was resignation. Because in his world, tenderness was seen as weakness, and weakness had no place in a future king. Sent away to Gordonstoun boarding school in Scotland, Charles's life behind the gates was even more brutal. His father, Prince Philip, believed in toughness, discipline, endurance. But for Charles, the daily experience became a living nightmare. He was mocked, beaten, isolated. Letters home revealed the truth the public never saw, how he cried himself to sleep, begged to come home, and felt completely abandoned. But his pleas went unheard. The monarchy demanded strength, and strength in their eyes meant silence. He learned early how to wear a mask, a smile for the cameras, composure in the face of humiliation. But deep down, the cracks were forming. Every royal engagement, every handshake, every wave, it was a performance, one that left no space for the boy still begging to be seen. As he grew older, the expectations only hardened. By the time he was a man, Charles was no longer shaping his own path. He was trapped inside a role he never chose. Every romantic decision, every public appearance, even the tone of his voice, it all had to be calculated, measured, rehearsed. The monarchy didn't allow for mistakes, but Charles made them anyway. Not because he was careless, but because he was human. And that humanity, often hidden beneath centuries of royal armor, was precisely what drew Pope Francis to him. The VTOAB, two men separated by oceans, status, and religion, shared something very few understood: a profound, soul-deep loneliness. It was Pope Francis who once said, "Kings and popes are always alone." That line wasn't meant to be poetic. It was a confession. Both men knew what it meant to be adored by millions and still feel unseen, to be feared, respected, idolized, but rarely truly known. And yet, Charles endured. He followed the rules, took the titles, played the part. But beneath the robes and rituals was a man quietly aching to be free. Free from expectation, free from comparison, free from the ghost of what the public thought a king should be. He carried the burden of tradition on his shoulders, but inside, the shadows only grew. Because no matter how hard he tried to be the monarch Britain demanded, the cost was always personal. He sacrificed pieces of himself to keep the image intact. But perhaps the most painful shadow Charles carried was the one left by Diana. He wears a crown now, holds the scepter, sits on the throne once occupied by legends. But beneath the surface, beneath the robes and rituals, King Charles carries something far heavier than jewels: guilt. The kind that lingers in silence. The kind that sleep can't wash away. Because no matter how many titles follow his name, the world remembers something else first: the woman he didn't fight hard enough to keep. Diana wasn't just a princess. She was a phenomenon, a symbol, a martyr in the eyes of millions. And Charles? He became the villain in her story. Their marriage, once hailed as a fairy tale, crumbled in full view of the world. Affairs, arguments, and accusations filled headlines. The world watched, judged, and took sides. And when Diana died in that Paris tunnel in 1997, something inside Charles shattered for good. In the days that followed her death, public rage reached a boiling point. Grief turned to fury, and the target was clear. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, demanding answers. Newspapers ran brutal headlines, questioning his humanity, his morality, his worth. Inside the palace, Charles was reportedly consumed by regret, torn apart by what-ifs, and haunted by the irreversible. Friends said he walked the halls like a ghost. One aide described him as a man unraveling under the weight of things unsaid. Because while the world mourned the woman they adored, Charles was left mourning something else: the chance to make it right, to apologize, to explain, to tell her everything he never could. But it was too late, and the guilt that followed him into the night never left. Years passed. The monarchy reshaped itself. New scandals emerged. New faces stepped forward. But Diana's shadow never faded. Every time he stood beside Camilla, every time William or Harry made a public appearance. Diana's name echoed louder than his own, and no amount of ceremony or silence could mute the reminder. Even Pope Francis, during one of their rare private meetings, could see it etched in his eyes. In 2017, behind the Vatican's doors, the Pope offered more than protocol, he offered grace. He spoke to Charles not as a monarch, but as a man burdened by ghosts. According to sources close to the meeting, the Pope leaned forward and said one simple thing: "You must forgive yourself before you can lead others." And in that moment, something cracked open. For a man trained to mask pain, to bury emotions, under layers of tradition, the words were seismic. Because Pope Francis wasn't offering sympathy, he was issuing a challenge: to confront the past, not rewrite it; to carry the shame, not run from it. And Charles knew he had spent decades doing the opposite: dodging, denying, surviving, but never facing it head-on. That day in Rome, something shifted. The guilt didn't vanish. But for the first time, Charles began to believe it didn't have to define him. That perhaps, in the ashes of everything he lost, there was still something left to build. And so began a slow spiritual awakening, one that would change the monarch the world thought they knew. While headlines raged over royal rifts, palace politics, and the looming question of succession, King Charles was undergoing a transformation no one saw coming. It didn't happen in public. It wasn't marked by grand speeches or sweeping gestures. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, far from the spotlight he'd once been chained to. In his 70s, long after most had stopped expecting anything new from him, Charles began to change. Not as a ruler, not as a symbol, but as a man. Alone in the stillness of early mornings, he turned to books that spoke not of crowns, but of conscience. Writings by Catholic saints, ancient Eastern mystics, and philosophers who questioned everything the world called power. For someone raised in the rigid structure of monarchy, this wasn't just reading, it was rebellion. His overseas tours, once choreographed to perfection for flashing cameras and diplomatic nods, took on a different rhythm. He started slipping away from official schedules, carving out time to visit secluded monasteries and centuries-old chapels. No reporters, no fanfare, just silence, and something he'd long been denied: peace. In one instance, during a visit to Romania, Charles reportedly spent hours alone in a forest chapel, praying and reading scripture in private. It wasn't part of the itinerary, but for him, it mattered more than any state dinner. And behind this shift was an unlikely guide: Pope Francis. The two had stayed in touch after their 2017 meeting, and what began as spiritual dialogue deepened into something far more intimate. The Pope sent him books. One in particular stood out: The Name of God is Mercy. Charles kept it by his bedside, reading it until the pages wore thin. This wasn't just curiosity, it was hunger. A desperate need to understand the man behind the title, to reconcile the guilt he'd carried with the grace he was seeking. Slowly, Charles began reshaping his message to the world. He no longer spoke only of climate or culture, but of compassion. He called for interfaith unity, not just tolerance. He championed the importance of humility in leadership, a concept almost blasphemous within royal tradition. And those around him started to notice. Palace staff began describing him as more emotional, gentler, less guarded. Not weak, but open. For the first time in decades, Charles wasn't trying to prove himself. He was trying to find himself. There were no grand announcements, no public declarations of change, but something inside him had undeniably shifted. The same man who once buried his emotions beneath protocol was now speaking softly about forgiveness, renewal, and moral responsibility. He hadn't abandoned the crown, but he was no longer letting it define him. His public addresses began to carry the echoes of Pope Francis, words wrapped in humility, weighted with reflection. And those listening closely knew this was a different king, one not molded by tradition, but redefined by truth. But then came the diagnosis, and everything changed once again. In the shadows of global headlines, while the world remained fixated on politics, scandal, and spectacle, two of the most powerful men on earth were fighting battles the public couldn't see. It was January 2024 when whispers first began to surface. Quiet shifts in schedules, missed appearances, unexplained delays. Behind Vatican walls, Pope Francis's health was deteriorating faster than anyone would admit. A series of emergency CPO. Hospitalizations were carefully disguised as routine checkups. But inside the Vatican, the atmosphere was different. Somber. Final. Those closest to the Pope knew the truth. The end was near. Yet, Francis never stopped working, never stopped speaking, and never stopped reaching out to the one man he believed needed his words the most, King Charles. Because across the English Channel, another secret was unraveling. One that would shake Buckingham Palace to its core. King Charles, only recently crowned, had been handed a diagnosis no monarch is ever prepared for: cancer. The details were buried in silence. The announcement delayed. The palace, as always, spoke in vague phrases and controlled language. But behind the regal stoicism was a man facing something he had spent a lifetime avoiding: mortality. And suddenly, the quiet transformation Charles had started in recent years took on new urgency. He began meditating daily. He revisited the books Pope Francis had sent him. And, according to sources close to the crown, he began praying. Not ceremonially, not out of duty, but with desperation. The two men, both in their twilight years, began exchanging private messages, not through official statements or diplomatic channels, but through letters. Raw, personal, unfiltered. Some were prayers, others reflections. There are whispers of one note where Pope Francis told Charles, "We are not judged by our crowns, but by our silence when others are suffering." And Charles, now stripped of illusion and armor, took those words to heart. While the press speculated and the public debated, Charles and Francis were navigating something far more sacred than politics. They were navigating the space between life and legacy, between what they had done and what they still had time to fix. Their connection deepened as their bodies weakened. Both leaders, once pillars of strength in their own domains, were now confronting the same unavoidable truth. Time was no longer their ally. And yet, even in decline, they led. Not with power, but with grace. Not with declarations, but with reflection. They taught the world that vulnerability is not weakness. That sometimes the most profound leadership comes not from speeches, but from stillness. And while neither man made their suffering public in real time, their actions revealed everything. Francis leaned into compassion. Charles leaned into faith. And together, even in their silence, they echoed something the world had long forgotten: that dignity is not found in how long you reign, but in how you rise when your body is failing. And then came the final message. It arrived in silence. No press conference, no flashing cameras, just a plain envelope, hand-delivered by a Vatican courier in the early hours of the morning, addressed to one man, and one man only: King Charles. The signature on the seal was unmistakable. It was from Pope Francis, and it came just hours before the Pope passed away. No announcement was made. The palace never released a statement. But someone inside Buckingham Palace, someone who saw the King's face after he read it, described the moment as devastating. Charles, a man known for composure, for restraint, reportedly sat alone for hours, not speaking, not moving, just holding the letter. And when he finally emerged, his eyes were red, silent, heavy. Because the message he had just read wasn't about politics or protocol. It was about him and everything he had been running from. Speculation exploded the moment whispers of the letter leaked. What had the Pope said? Was it about the line of succession? Was he weighing in on Camilla's place as queen consort? Or had he mentioned William, perhaps urging Charles to step aside before it was too late? Some feared it might be darker. A warning, a prophecy, an accusation. But the truth, as it always is in moments like this, was far more human. Chan Vatican. Sources later revealed fragments of the message. Not all, just enough to hint at the tone. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea, a meditation on kingship, a reflection on the burden of legacy, and, most strikingly, a call for forgiveness. One line stood out above the rest, repeated by multiple sources. Heal what was broken before they inherit what remains. A sentence that carried the weight of history and the responsibility of the future. For Charles, those words didn't just echo, they thundered. Because no one knew better than he did what had been broken. The relationships with his sons, fractured by years of silence, resentment, and distance. The trust of a public that had loved Diana and still viewed him with suspicion. The unity of a monarchy strained by scandal, modernity, and generational shifts. And within all that, a deeper fracture, the one inside himself. The Pope hadn't given him advice. He had handed him a mirror, a final chance, not to be a better king, but to be a better man. Charles has never spoken publicly about that letter. He never confirmed its contents, never denied them either. But those closest to him, advisors, friends, even family, say something changed that day. Not visibly, not overnight, but in his tone, in his decisions, in his eyes. The crown on his head remained the same, but the man beneath it didn't. Because sometimes the most powerful words don't come from a throne. They come from a dying man, writing with the clarity only death can bring. But what if the message wasn't just for the king, but for the entire monarchy? We may never know exactly what Pope Francis wrote in that final letter. The words, like the man who wrote them, are now sealed in history, private, unconfirmed, and possibly never to be revealed. But their effect? That doesn't need confirmation. Because since the Pope's passing, something in King Charles has shifted. His tone, once formal and carefully measured, now trembles with something deeper, humility. At the 2025 World Climate Summit, he stood before global leaders and spoke not just of policy, but of compassion. He quoted Laudato Si', the very encyclical written by Francis years earlier, saying, "Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home." It wasn't just a speech, it was a signal, a quiet tribute, and a subtle warning that time was running out, not just for the planet, but for the very soul of global leadership. Behind closed doors, the transformation grew even more visible to those closest to him. In private, Charles began reaching out to faith leaders from across religious divides. Not for headlines, not for image, but for understanding. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Chief Rabbi, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. Conversations once brokered by political advisors now came from Charles himself. No intermediaries, just one man trying to bridge centuries of division. It was a move few expected from a monarch once defined by tradition. But this wasn't the Charles the world had known. This was a man reshaped, haunted by loss, awakened by mortality, and moved by a dying pope's final act of grace. And it didn't stop with words. Inside the royal foundation, the structure of his charitable work began to evolve. Long-standing initiatives were re-evaluated, budgets restructured, focus shifted from ceremonial patronage to grassroots impact. Several reforms, especially those centered around healthcare access and refugee support, mirrored outreach programs pioneered by the Vatican. Coincidence? Not according to insiders. One senior royal advisor described the new approach as Vatican-inspired pragmatism, blending moral responsibility with modern execution. Another staff member simply said, "He's different now. It's like the Pope's last words live inside him." But this change wasn't about optics. It was about legacy. Charles knew the crown was no longer a symbol of untouchable power. In the modern world, it had to earn its place every day through service, transparency, and humanity. And maybe that's what Pope Francis had intended all along. To remind the king that titles don't define greatness, choices do. That redemption isn't found in tradition, but in transformation. And perhaps the most powerful legacies are the ones whispered, not declared, lived, not performed. So, while the contents of that sealed letter may never be read by the public, its echoes are already shaping a new chapter in the British monarchy. A chapter not ruled by authority, but by empathy. One man lost his life. The other found his purpose. But one question still remains. How will history remember this bond between crown and cross? One ruled a church, the other a kingdom. And yet, in the final chapter of their lives, they stood side by side, two men carrying the weight of centuries, trying to make sense of a world that no longer bowed to crowns or cassocks. Pope Francis, the reformer who dared to show the Vatican's humanity, spent his final years dismantling the idea that holiness was tied to hierarchy. His reign wasn't marked by grandeur, but by grace. He washed the feet of prisoners. He embraced the sick. He led with tears, not thunder. His legacy is not carved in marble, it's etched into the hearts of those who finally saw the Church not as an empire, but as a refuge. And in his final act, he gave his most intimate blessing not to a cardinal, not to a saint, but to a king. King Charles, once mocked, once condemned, once buried beneath the weight of public shame, emerged not as the flawless monarch many demanded, but as something far rarer, a man who changed, a man who listened, who wept, who evolved. His spiritual transformation, shaped quietly by the words of a dying pope, marked the most profound shift in the monarchy since the death of Diana. This was not diplomacy. This was not strategy. This was redemption. And in that bond built not on policy or pageantry, but on pain, they shattered the illusion that power must always be stoic, distant, cold. The letter became more than just ink on paper. It became a passing of the torch from a man who had mastered mercy to one who had just begun to understand it. Their intertwined stories, one from the Vatican, the other from the palace, offer a singular truth. Healing does not begin when we are perfect. It begins when we are honest. And maybe, just maybe, the Pope's last words weren't meant to crown a king, but to free a man. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.